United Methodist tradition comes from sort of preaching.
Microphone, Richard.
Oh, microphone. Can you hear me now? The United Methodist tradition comes out of a preaching background. I'll share a little bit about it in a minute. The story goes that young man and his father go to the United Methodist Church, and they sit down in the front row, and the pastor removes his watch and puts it on the pulpit, and the son says, "Daddy, what does it mean when he does that?" And the father looks at him and says, "Nothing." So I'll try to stick to our 12 minutes here. A number of years ago, I attended. By the way, I am Richard Strait. I am the lead pastor at Peace United Methodist Church on West North Avenue, about 129. I attended an ecumenical gathering a number of years ago in Cincinnati, and it was a group much smaller than this, but we sat in a circle, and the convener asked to go around and say who your name was, what your background was. And before it got to me, there was another woman in the circle who I'd never met, who said that her name was, where she came from, and that she was a United Methodist. And the convener of the group looked at her and said, "That's an oxymoron, isn't it?" And in some respects, that is indeed the case. We are united, but we have struggled with division also. Our history traced back to John and Charles Wesley, both of whom were ordained Anglican priests in the Church of England. The Methodist Church itself began to take its own form on December the 24th, 1784. There is a difference between Methodism in England and Methodism in the United States, simply because of the cultural differences out of which the two arose. The Methodist Church in England is probably far more tied into John Wesley and Charles Wesley and the Wesleyan tradition. We're more tied into, if you will, a frontier mentality and independent kind of thinking. We, like most all major religious traditions and divisions, the Lutherans, Martin Luther did not want to split from the Catholic Church. He wanted to transform it. John Wesley did not want to split from the Church of England. He wanted to transform it. We got thrown out. And, so that's how that all began. So the Methodist tradition comes out of Church of England rootage, if you will. For us today, we know that as the Episcopal Church. Now, I did my seminary work at an Episcopal seminary, so I was trained as an Episcopal priest and given all the kind of static that a Methodist would at an Episcopalian seminary. Because we are different here on this side of the puddle than our English brothers and sisters are, and because we were founded as a movement and denomination in 1784, the Methodist Church in the United States is very, very similarly organized to the Constitution of the United States. We have a legislative, a judicial, and an executive branch. The executive branch is our Council of Bishops. Our judicial branch is the Judiciary Council. And the legislative branch is a group that meets every 4 years. We call our General Conference, with representatives from all of the annual conferences all around the world. If you want to know what the United Methodists believe, that belief system can change every 4 years based upon the legislative action of the General Conference. Now, at the end of the General Conference, a book of discipline is written, which is sort of the marching orders for the church for the next 4 years until the next General Conference. This is the book of discipline of 1948, when I was just a little kid. This is the 2008 book of discipline. So it gives you some sense that we are struggling with these issues of discipline. But we were organized in a very, very democratic way. We are not a clergy-centered denomination. As we come to our conferences, there are always more lay folks represented than there are clergy represented. Clergy, if ever a vote was taken between clergy and laity, clergy would always lose. We're always in the vast minority of representation in those organizations. We began not so much as structured churches as we began with the frontier mentality of circuit riders. The Church of England had churches on the East Coast, and they stayed pretty much there. As our American frontier began to move west, they said the first two things to get in any area would be the Crows and the Methodist circuit riders. So we were right on the edge of the expansion, American expansion. Our circuit riders came from both an English, a German, and a Scandinavian background. Now, part of the struggle with United Methodism, and I'll tell the history of that in just a second, we came with lots of conflicts. John Wesley was thrown out of the Church of England because he felt the church ought to be for people who were common, not just the rich and famous. He took his message to the coal mines, he took his message to the farmers' fields, to the textile mills. They were very social oriented. Child labor laws, welfare for the poor, building of hospitals, schools, that type of thing. So we were very much involved initially on with social justice kinds of issues, along with our spiritual religious backgrounds and formations. However, we began to experience conflicts here as well as we did in England. The Methodist Church split in the 1870s over the question of slavery, and it became the Methodist Episcopal Church South and the Methodist Episcopal Church. The southern group wanted to retain the slaves, the northern group did not. Another big hassle took place in the early 1950s, the question of ordination of women. That question was resolved in 1954, and we began the ordination of women in the Methodist tradition. Even though the question of slavery got resolved and some splits got reconciled, we did not really join together in an organic way with our African American brothers and sisters until 1968. And for the last 38 years, the United Methodist Church has argued, fought, and torn itself apart, like many Christian denominations have, over the question of homosexuality. It still continues to be a divided church in that respect. However, there have been many reunions and reconciliations. The North and South Church in 1938 reunited again and dropped the Episcopal language, Episcopal Church South, Methodist Episcopal Church, and became the Methodist Church. We had German-speaking and Scandinavian-speaking congregations who followed a Wesleyan tradition. One was called the Evangelical Association, the other was called the United Brethren in Christ. In 1948, those two churches merged together to form what many now would remember as the Evangelical United Brethren Church, the EUBs. They were simply German-speaking Methodists with these other backgrounds. In 1968, the EUB and the Methodists merged together to form the United Methodist Church. So, as a denomination, United Methodism began in 1968. Now, you can see there have been many divisions, and there have been many reconciliations. Some divisions still exist, like we've heard from our Unitarian and UCC brothers and sisters. We believe that you got to keep your head and mind plugged in. God gave us the tools to utilize, and we must utilize them. Our worship can be all the way from high church, Episcopalian, to what we call a low church, which maybe some would say is a free church experience, which may be very similar to what some experience in the Southern Baptist tradition. However, our theology would be far more open than that kind of a background. What has kept us together is not agreement on issues, but agreement on the centrality of God's grace, as we believe that has been experienced through the man and the message of Jesus, who we do indeed believe to be the Messiah, a reflection, an image of the divine in human form. It's that centrality of grace that has made the United Methodist experience unique. We split all the time. Churches, well, for instance, denominationalism is a sign of human sin. It says we didn't agree, so we split the sheets. Somehow we divided because we didn't like what somebody else was doing. And so I don't know how many hundreds of different Christian denominations there are right now, but we all disagree with somebody about something, which is a mark of our division rather than our unity. Our founder, now, we got the name Methodist, by the way, because the Wesleys were very methodical in their approach. Now, you can tell that we retain some of that methodical nature, but Wesley, for his circuit-riding preachers, some of which were almost illiterate, he had a series of 151 different sermons that they were supposed to get to know and memorize. I'm only going to share about 30 or 40 with you tonight. But one of his sermons, called "The Catholic Spirit," is important, I think, for folks to sort of know where we come from in the midst of our division. 2 minutes, hurry on here. Okay. Wesley talked about there will be many different opinions, there'll be many different ideas. And he uses the text, an Old Testament text, 2 Kings 10:15, and it speaks about if our hearts be one, then let us join our hands. He recognized that we will differ on opinions. We'll differ on understanding of sacraments. We'll differ on understanding of doctrines. We'll differ on understandings of how we are to interpret the creeds. But the fruit of that is how we live and respond to one another. Are we the ambassadors and the reflection of the love that God has for all of creation? And do we manifest that love even in the midst of our divisions? And so he speaks about if we be together, then if our hearts be together, give your hands. But he says, we don't join together on opinion. First, if we're to join together, love me. And he shares with that. Love me as a companion in the kingdom and the presence of Jesus and the joint heir of Christ's glory. Secondly, I mean, by giving your hand, commend me to God in all your prayers. And thirdly, provoke me to love and do good works. And fourthly, lastly, love me not in word only, but in deed and in truth. So for the United Methodist tradition, it is indeed the process of living the message, sharing the message in love, in peace, and in harmony, even with those whose opinions we may disagree with.